Where the Sidewalk Ends is a 1950 American film noir directed by the legendary Otto Preminger. Yes, we're covering him again. Gotcha. Yes, it is noir-vember, and as you may have guessed or may not have guessed, this week's episode is a pretty underrated noir, to say the least. It's probably the least famous of the ones we're covering this month, and that's all I'm going to give you now in the intro. See you soon. It's the Golden Hour Film Podcast. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Golden Hour Film Podcast. I am, of course, joined by my co-host, not guest host, Shane Mulvaney.
How are you doing, Harry?
I'm very good, and yes, it is noir-vember. It is where the sidewalk ends. If you figured this one out, fair play to you. I had a pretty tough time trying to figure out how to allude to this in the clues. So one of the clues, of course, is the excerpt from the book that it's based on, Night Cry by William L. Stewart. But besides that, not an easy one. Also, the two Otto Premingers. I can spoil that one now as well because we've already done Laura.
Yeah.
And that's all you're getting out of me. The rest of the clues you can figure out yourself. But yeah, Where the Sidewalk Ends, it's one of those ones, I don't know if you'd agree with me. I always heard the name, but I never really knew much about it. But it was a film name. It's such a great film name, I think. But it's a film name that has always stood out to me as far as film noir goes. Did you know much about it beforehand?
No, I actually didn't even, I hadn't even heard of it. I don't think. Maybe in the back of my mind when I was researching, because earlier this year I was going through a period where I was getting into Otto Preminger, so I watched Laura for the first time. I watched Anatomy of a Murder.
Great film.
Incredible film. And then I probably saw the fact that this is one of his other titles, but yeah, I don't think. Other than that, I probably wouldn't have even heard of it, to be honest with you. So it's I think I'm always intrigued by film noir because they do have some of the most creative titles. Like I think I've mentioned on the podcast before, I saw a film. It's not even a particularly good noir. It's okay, it's solid, forgettable kind of thing. But it's just called It's called Appointment with Danger, and it's like. Boom.
Yeah.
That's literally the only reason I saw the film is because Appointment with Danger. It's like, oh, that just sounds so good.
They always have great titles. It's always the subpar ones. Because I watched one. The title doesn't necessarily sound as good until you figure out the plot. But it's called I Wouldn't Want to Be in Your Shoes.
Nice.
Spoiler alert: it's a murder mystery because they caught the guy's shoes at the at the crime scene. But then there's a whole subplot about the shoes and the shoe size. It's great. Well, it's actually not. It's actually not great. It's a film noir that exists that I've seen. It's fine. It's pretty quintessential,
boilerplate
classic noir.
Boiler.
Yeah.
There's a lot noir in general is a genre where, unless it's done really well, it can just come across as really boilerplate, like paint by numbers. This is what you do in a noir. Bam, bam, bam. You're almost checking a box. You're almost checking a box. Bam, bam, bam. You can kind of almost forget about it after you've seen it. But the ones that really stand out and the ones that really slap, they're so memorable because of the atmosphere really that they bring to it. I think that's one of the reasons we both loved Laura from last week's episode. It's just a different atmosphere and tension and a different vibe, and I think it's something that all Preminger in general even come back to. Anatomy of Murder, which isn't a noir, it's a courtroom drama, but again, it's just the atmosphere that he kind of brings to his films.
Yeah, I genuinely think that anyone in any film school could make a film noir, and it would be a film noir right down to its core. But to actually make a film noir a classic, because there's so many of them, is a feat in its own, because it's such a saturated genre from the time that anything that has risen above the rest, it tends to be for good reason because of how many film noirs exist. And yeah, Where the Sidewalk Ends, just get into a quick spoiler-free review. I really liked it. Again, it's Dana Andrews and Gene Tierney from last week, both star in it. I do think it's maybe not as polished as Laura. I don't necessarily think the direction is just as exceptional as Laura. That being said, I think it's probably more stereotypical noir than Laura in the characters it deals with and the shady gangsters and stuff. But again, one thing I love about this film, and it comes even earlier than Laura, is you think that the film is about a certain thing, and then it gets flipped on its head much sooner than Laura, and it's not straight away, but much sooner than Laura, a inciting incident happens in this film that just changes the whole film massively, and what you thought you were getting to see is not what you're going to get to see at all. It's actually a totally different movie to what you were expecting. No spoilers here. What did you think?
Yeah, I really enjoyed it as well. For a lot of reasons you just said. It does kind of deal with more, again, like what you said, it does deal with more conventional noir tropes than Laura, maybe, because you do have like the roguish kind of cops. You have the dirty kind of untrustworthy gangsters that he's kind of investigating. Yeah, and then a great twist, well, a very, very, very good twist, kind of early-ish in the film at the end of the first act, which does really kind of help the rest of the film go kind of barrel along then at that point, because it does keep you guessing. I'd say it's a notch below Laura, to be honest. I'd say it's definitely a notch below Laura, but I think it's still better than like a lot of the noirs that I've seen from the time period, because mainly because of Dana Andrews, to be honest. I think he actually has more, probably a little bit more to do in this film than in Laura, where I think it was more about the ensemble, how they each interact with Laura, how they each kind of view Laura, the character of Laura, when she's on screen and when she's not on screen. Whereas in this, he's the person who's kind of relied on to carry the moral kind of ambiguity and the moral kind of tensions and conflicts of the piece. So from that point of view, I think he's probably more of a conventional noir lead character, and I think he does rise to the challenge, unsurprisingly, because he is a really, really good noir kind of performer from the time period. There's a bunch of great noirs that he's in. So yeah, like I said, a notch below Laura, but still really, really enjoyable, to be honest.
Yeah, I think we'll get into what we watched recently at the end of this episode, and in the meantime, if you are new here, please do subscribe, leave a like on the video, and try and guess what we're going to cover next week in the comments. In the meantime, shall we get into where the sidewalk ends?
We shall.
And straight away, we get a pretty great title card, which is Where the Sidewalk Ends, painted on the end of a sidewalk. Good stuff. Love it. And we see detectives Dixon and Klein are pretty much running late for something. We don't really know what it is, but they get to the 16th precinct, and it turns out that Lieutenant Thomas is basically being sworn in as the main man. He is the man in charge now of the 16th precinct, and yeah, not even much is said when Dixon and Klein show up late, and we kind of get to learn more or less straight away after that it's kind of to be expected with these two, especially Dixon, because Dixon gets pulled into the superior's office, not Thomas, the other guy, and he basically says, you and Lieutenant Thomas started at the same time. He is being promoted to lieutenant, and I am actually having to give you a demotion right now because you keep getting yourself into trouble. Assault, battery,
12,
spending...
yeah. 12 cases of battery that he's been investigated for from various suspects who say that he's been on the rougher side with them. So again, police brutality, it's not great, is it?
Yeah, no, not ideal. He's definitely a more rugged and questionable character,
roguish,
than his character from the week previous, McPherson. Dixon is this feels more like a character study as well within a noir rather than an ensemble, as you said. And basically, Dixon, he spends a lot of time around gangsters. He hates them, don't get me wrong, but he spends a lot of time around them, and he just keeps getting himself into trouble with them, it seems. And what does he do?
He checks in with a parolee called Willie, who he later who visits him. Sorry, he's asking about this like illegal casino that a gangster called Tommy Scalise is apparently running, kind of shady kind of hotel.
They throw dice on a table. It's as shady as the 40s and 50s gets. They throw dice on a table and they put money on it.
So then they go to see Scalise, and Morgan, who was played by Jean Tierney, she's at this casino with her husband, who is his name is escaping me.
Payne.
Payne, that's correct. Yeah, Payne.
Yeah.
She's also there with a guy called Morrison, and turns out that Morrison's doing pretty well for himself because he's about 19 grand up which obviously
Yes.
isn't something that Scalise is happy about because he's rinsing him dry.
No.
And Morrison and Payne get into a bit of a confrontation because, Morrison and Payne, because Morgan is
She's looking to leave. She's tired,
yeah,
and she says to him, "I want to go home to bed." And he's like, "All right, let's leave." And Ken Payne, who says to his wife, "You can't leave right now." And she's like, "What are you talking about? I'm leaving." And he's like, "No, I don't think you understand. I brought this man to Scalise, and he has just fleeced Scalise out of 19K. You're not leaving." And she's like, "I am," and he hits her. So she basically heads out, but her friend Morrison steps in and just wails on him, hits Payne, and Payne wrestles him to the floor. And that's kind of all we kind of see of that scuffle for now. We will come back to it, though, not long later.
Yeah, Dixon and Klein hear about this confrontation on the radio. So it doesn't take long for Dixon. Dixon's kind of on the warpath for these guys anyway. And as soon as he hears that it's something to do with Scalise, he's first on the scene.
He's straight there, yeah.
He's straight there. So they go on and they see that this guy Morrison has been stabbed to death. So off screen, it would seem that Payne kind of took things too far, and it wasn't just a scuffle that he actually ended up murdering this guy. So that's not
Dixon,
great.
Dixon kind of squares up to Scalise straight away. He makes a beeline for Scalise after he sees the body, and he hears the Scalise's here, and Scalise straight away says that his father liked him, so he doesn't understand why he's being this way with him, and that pisses Dixon off even more. We kind of get these little droplets of
backstory,
backstory as to Dixon's father, and this is the first one. But basically Scalise kind of retells the story to the police, but with a few minor tweaks, just minor, I guess. First of all, he says he was winning. He said he was only up about $1,000 when your man decided to leave, and but that he was winning, and out of jealousy, Ken Payne didn't like the fact that the fact that this woman, we don't know that they're husband and wife at this point, but that this woman is leaving with Morrison. So out of jealousy, he hit him. They kind of scuffled into a bedroom, and then in said bedroom, Payne came out not long later and just went straight out the front door and didn't acknowledge anyone. And then Morrison just fell out of the room, and he had been stabbed, and none of them have seen Payne ever since.
Yeah.
So Dixon, he's only kind of going to go to one place. He goes to see Payne in his place, and as I said,
it's not
things
great,
get interesting very early in this film.
Yeah, just the inciting incident that you were talking about, because when he gets to Payne's place, he comes across him attempting to call Morrison. So that's a bit strange because he's killed him. Why would he be trying to call him? He seems to not realise that he's dead, obviously. So Dixon says that Scalise is trying to frame you for Morrison's murder. Obviously, he puts two and two together, and he's obviously suspicious of Scalise anyway. By the way, Scalise had mentioned a case where Dixon had arrested Scalise for murder and a jury had acquitted him. Kind of implied that he may have paid some people off. That's Dixon's impression anyway. So he's very, very untrustworthy of Scalise, and he knows what he's capable of. So he says to him, "Look, he's trying to frame you for murder. So obviously, if you didn't do this, you have to tell me what happened, because otherwise you're gonna go down for a long time." And Payne, for some reason, just is very dismissive of him, and he punches him.
Doesn't like cops.
Doesn't like cops. So again, a brawl breaks out. Payne's kind of getting around in this evening. He's getting into a couple of scraps already, and then Dixon decks Payne, who falls to the ground, and then Dixon goes over to him and he says, "Look, get up." He realizes that he's actually dead for some reason. This single punch has killed Payne. So it's pretty crazy.
We'll find out later, but
why?
There is reason behind it. And then straight away the phone rings, and Dixon answers it, and it's Klein, his partner, who says, "Just to let you know, I've kind of been interviewing around the place, and it turns out that this fella is a war hero. Payne is a war hero, and he also writes a weekly column, so he's actually got some pretty high up newspaper. Comes up a lot on the podcast. He's got some quite high up newspaper connections, so maybe don't give him the one over, if you will. Kind of take it easy on him, because this could go pretty south for you. All right, thanks, Klein. Hangs up the phone. Straight away, Premingers just like, let's get this face on camera, because the facial acting's brilliant. He's just
Loads
like, I have literally ruined my life with one punch. I've literally just ruined it all. It's all over for me. But straight away, pretty shady, pretty rogue, as you said. He starts to switch around the scene, if you will, and he starts undressing Payne, and he starts taking some of his clothes out of his dresser drawer as well. And he orders a cab to the local train station. And as well, because of there was a knife involved in the scuffle previously with Morrison, he had a gash across his face, so he had a plaster on his face. So he actually takes the plaster and puts it on his own face as well, just in case anyone identified him. And he goes out when the cab arrives with the big suitcase that clearly says Kenneth Payne on it. And he sees that the neighbor, this old lady, has seen him, and he kind of thinks nothing of it because he's pretty far away and it is quite dark out, but she does make eye contact with him, and he gets into the back of the taxi. The taxi man brings him to the train station, and he goes and he buys tickets to Pittsburgh on the train, and he kind of makes it a thing that he wants to be recognized here. And it's also alluded to later that he also put the bag, the Kenneth Payne bag, in a locker in this train station. Meanwhile, Klein has shown up because he's like, what the fuck, Dixon? Like, Dixon's supposed to be in this apartment. Where is he? Why is he running late? So he just goes in himself, and he goes in and he can't find anything. And kind of as he goes in, Dixon just catches up to him. He's like, oh, sorry. I called from earlier and he wasn't here, so I checked all the local bars, but I thought I'd come back. And Klein's like, oh, right, okay, have you any luck or anything? He's like, no, nothing. He wasn't here. They kind of snoop around and they don't find anything. And Klein kind of points at the closet and is like, oh, what's in the closet? And he opens it, and using the door, he kind of hides Payne's dead body in there from Klein's eyesight, but we see it on camera. So he opens it and there's a dead body, and then he goes, no, nothing in there, and he just closes it back over again. So he's like, right, we gotta go and check out what happened. So they ask the neighbor, and she says, oh no, I saw him get in a taxi just there. I don't know where he was going. So they agree that Klein is going to go and interrogate some of the local taxi drivers, whereas Dixon is going to go and interview some of the local people who work in garages. He's going back to the crime scene because he's got to get rid of that body. And when he gets back, there's a new taxi driver there, and he's not the one we saw before.
No, so he goes back to try and get Payne's body in. Just as he's about to carry it downstairs, someone comes in, another taxi driver, like Harry said, and starts banging on Payne's door in a really angry way, obviously. And we're not too sure who this person is at this point, but he's not too pleased with Payne. After a few seconds, he realizes Payne isn't there. He doesn't answer the door, so he leaves. And then Dixon carries the body and he puts it in the back seat of the car. Interesting, he didn't go for the trunk. Would have thought he would just go for the trunk. Yeah. Puts it in the back seat of the car, and and then another cop then has come in, and he starts to show Payne's suitcase to the lieutenant in the precinct. They've obviously got this from the train station, so they clocked on that this Payne guy seems to have been trying to scarp her in a real hurry. That aroused their suspicions. So they interviewed a cab driver who basically says, I dropped them off at the station. So they're like, okay, clearly this guy skipped town, and clearly he realised what he did, and
they either say he either skipped town or he tried to create the illusion that he skipped town, and he's actually hidden out somewhere in one of Scalise's locations, because obviously he knows what he did, because they are pretty much all certain in this precinct that it was Payne who had murdered your man Morrison previously with the knife. It's interesting that they are all so quick to dismiss that it could have been Scalise behind it all. It's one of the things that kind of helps you identify a bit with Dixon. They do it a few times in the film, which is well. But just like Scalise is so blatantly, obviously the head man, and for some reason the police are just more focused on catching his cronies rather than Scalise himself, which is kind of the bane of Dixon's existence. He just wants to see Scalise behind bars, but now he's got a much bigger issue at hand because he's also a murderer.
Yeah, and Dixon, they have like a few beds in the precinct, so people can catch a few winks. So he goes to bed that evening for a couple of hours, but it turns out he didn't actually go to sleep. He's been wide awake the whole time. And then another cop comes in and says, we found the Morgan Taylor girl. So the girl who was at the casino the previous evening. So her father then, they call her, but then her father answers and says that she's gone to work. So what they do is they go and visit her job. And when they get there, they say to her, she's kind of already in a conversation with one of her colleagues, and her colleague, she's obviously told her about the slap from her husband. She says, you're better off without him. He's a piece of work. He's no good for you, etc., etc. So then they get there and they start to question her, and she says that she's married, but they've been separated for a while. She says that she left when Payne slapped her. And she says that she hung up when he called her then later that evening. So then her father then visited Payne because he found out that obviously about the slap. So having previously threatened to kill Payne, obviously once he finds out about this slap, then he's kind of saw red mist. So I think Dixon at this point is putting two and two together and realising that the other guy who arrived was Mr. Taylor, her father.
Yeah, so he walks her out of the place and he says off the record that he actually wants to go for dinner with her, which she accepts. She says, "Oh, I'm actually just like a couple of subway stops away. Come on ahead. I'll get ready as soon as I can. You can just wait around." So they go back to hers, and he meets the father. And the father, this is one of the great moments throughout this film where Preminger and Ben Hecht also wrote this, who I feel like we've covered a few of his screenplays.
Notorious, Spellbound. Yeah. He's done a couple of life.
They do a really good job of humanizing and kind of localizing Dixon. It's like, he spends a lot of his time with like local thugs and gangsters, but he also deals with a lot of the locals' problems because this taxi driver straight away is like, "Oh, you're a hero. You actually, would you remember you used my taxi to catch all those guys at Central Park?"
Yeah, and, 6 years later.
Yeah, and he got like a big thing from the mayor, the taxi driver did, to basically say he was a hero, whereas all he's saying is that it was all Dixon, and it was Dixon's courage or whatever. And Dixon's very modest about it. He doesn't even really remember it. He's like, "Oh, you know."
Yeah, it's an everyday occurrence for him.
yeah. He's like, I appreciate it anyway. And at this point, Morgan's gotten ready. So it's time for them to go out for dinner. And again, they go out to this local restaurant, and straight away the woman recognizes Dixon.
Martha, yeah.
And she's like, "Oh, you're here, but you're actually here with a woman. Fair play to you, you loser." But like kind of in a jokey way.
They have a really... they have a fun relationship where they're like making fun of each other, but clearly they have a lot of like mutual respect. So I think at a little point later, she basically, Martha, who runs the restaurant, she mentions that Dixon helped her out with jam when he didn't really have to. So she obviously is quite fond of him for that reason.
It was her husband.
Yeah.
He put her husband in prison for domestic abuse. Yeah. So he kind of changed her life as well.
Yeah. Exactly, yeah. So Dixon gets a call from Klein then saying that we found Payne's body in the river, which he's not too pleased about. But he tries to kind of gloss over that with his skull cracked, they said. So that's an important point as well, obviously. But then when Dixon leaves, then Martha tells Morgan that it's good that it's good that he seems to be kind of on a date with another girl, because he said he needs a wife and a kids because he's married to the job, so he needs something to like kind of take his mind off of work. Basically, he needs something, another outlet. So then we go, and the cops figure out that Payne was actually killed in his apartment because he had a silver plate in his head from the war. Mm-hmm. He turns out he's a war hero, and that was cracked when his skull hit the ground, basically hit the floor, which obviously Dixon wasn't to know. So it's really manslaughter. It's not murder. It's manslaughter.
Yeah. But he's too far gone at this point.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's he would have gone to prison anyway, but not for as obviously not for as anywhere near as long. But yeah, he's been lying about it for a couple of days at this point that he doesn't really have any other out. Then the lieutenant figures out then from a bloodstain on the wall that the killer stashed him in the closet that you had mentioned earlier. And he questions Dixon then about like how could you have missed him? You literally must have just missed him.
Yeah.
Like what the hell were you doing? Because Dixon had come up with this cock and bull story of like once he wasn't there, I went out to local bars and was trying to see if people saw him. And the lieutenant's like, why would you do that? Like he's on the run. He's not going to go into a bar where people could see him. Like that was a stupid thing to do. Like you should have had more sense than that. Not putting two and two together at this point. But yeah, Dixon's kind of flailing about trying to cover his tracks and not doing a particularly good job at the moment.
Yeah, they get to the conclusion that it couldn't have been Scalise, and they also find out then that the father had shown up and was banging on the door, and now all of a sudden the lieutenant is fixated on the idea that the father killed him
because he has motive and he has opportunity. The two biggest things.
Yeah, obviously. And the timeline checks out as well. Yeah. Because supposedly the father got there in and around the time where he was definitely home. But yeah, it is a confusing one, the timeline thing, because like everybody's timelines don't quite work, which is what makes it so confusing for everyone. But anyway, they do call in the father and Morgan to come to Ken's apartment to question him. And yeah, the father's pretty nonchalant about it. He's like, I expected, because I didn't get on with my son-in-law that I'd be questioned. So I'll tell you the truth. I did threaten to bash his brains in if he ever hit my daughter again, which is exactly what I threatened to do. And then I got here and he wasn't here.
Yeah.
And they're like, and then what? And he's like, what do you mean?
Yeah. He says he got there at 2:15 and he wasn't there, so he left. Then he says that he picked up a fare from Congressman Reynolds. So not just anyone, like a politician, a very prominent politician. So that's a possible alibi for him. Then he gives the names of other taxi drivers who he says saw him out and about that night. So he's kind of doing just about enough to kind of stave off an arrest, even though he's prime suspect number one. He's doing just about enough to convince the cops that we can't arrest him just yet until we check these alibis out.
So they go to the neighbour then, and because she doesn't necessarily seem like the most trustworthy. Not that she's shady or anything, but just she doesn't really have a clue what's going on.
Yeah, she's more like a little bit all over the place, maybe.
Yeah, a bit oblivious to kind of what's going on around her. And they're asking her, was it definitely Ken that you saw leave and get into that taxi? And she's like, yep, it was definitely Ken. I knew it was him. And they're like, how could you have possibly seen him? It was dark. He was far away. He had a trench coat and a hat. How could you have possibly recognized him? And she's like, it was him. And the lieutenant's like, right, now, do you know what? We'll do a test. And he asks the father to get into a trench coat and a hat and do the same thing. And Morgan steps in and she's like, this is ridiculous. You're literally just trying to pin this on him. Like, he's innocent. He doesn't have to do this. So they get one of the other detectives to do it instead. And the detective goes out from far away and he says, well, does that look like who you saw the night of Ken getting into the taxi? And she goes, no, I know it's not Ken. And he's like, well, obviously you know it's not Ken. And she's like, no, I know it's not Ken because he's not waving at me.
It was actually
every time he ever saw me, he waved at me.
It was actually Dixon who they got to put. They said that Dixon was the same build, same height as Payne. So obviously he's then the shits are put up him because he's like, what if she actually recognizes me? Like, because they did share a bit of eye contact a couple of nights earlier. She doesn't recognize Dixon, but then she does remember that he didn't wave. So actually it wasn't him after all. And then that's enough then for the lieutenant to be like, right, it was obviously this Taylor guy. So yeah, they arrest him for the murder. And Taylor swears to Morgan that he didn't do it. And she's like, yeah, I know you didn't do it. And we're going to get to the end of this. But she's upset and she's fearful of what might happen. So Klein praises the new lieutenant for wrapping the case up. But Dixon says that Scalise did both jobs. And then Dixon and Klein obviously partners, but they always almost come to blows at this point because Klein can't understand why he's so fixated on Scalise when there's no evidence that he did either crime, especially the second crime. Then Dixon goes to see Scalise and he slaps him and he says, I know Morrison was into you for 19 grand, or you were into Morrison for 19 grand. You owed him 19 grand, so that's a motive for you to have killed Morrison. And then he said you killed Payne to keep it quiet. So again, he's trying to mesh the two crimes together. Even though obviously he's responsible for the second one, he's trying to mesh the two of them together.
Yeah.
And a fight breaks out, and Dixon kind of manages to beat up a couple of guys, but then they just overwhelm him. And they leave
Ernie.
him.
Ernie was too much for him.
Ernie, yeah. So a couple of
he beats up Steve, and then I think it's John and Ernie come in, and Ernie's just a mouthful. He's a handful. Sorry, not a mouthful. Jesus, different movie. They take him to the ground. And they just batter him basically, and it gets to a point where Scalise picks up a stool, and he's ready to like smash him in the back of the head. And
he says,
Steve steps in and says, "Boss, I don't think you realize just how much heat you would get if you murdered a policeman with a stool." Maybe
it's actually a lot of noirs like they're kind of painted as just dumb henchmen, but that's actually a really good piece of advice. It's one of the weird ones where it's like the second in command or the consigliere to fucking Scalise is actually probably more kind of measured and like more reasonable than the main man, which isn't always the case in these kind of films.
Yeah, so they agreed to just leave him there, and they all head, but in a daze, Dixon kind of gets up eventually, and he goes straight to Morgan's house, and he kind of collapses into her house because he still has been hit in the head, just not with the stool. And he needs a drink, and he has a drink, and she tries to kind of mend him. This scene's basically just in there for them to kind of get a little bit closer to each other, because he then leaves more or less straight away and goes to Klein's house and asks Klein for money. Klein is literally like, he's kind of like, I thought we weren't getting on. What's happening here? And he goes into his wife to kind of consort with her, and she's like, you literally said the next time you see him you were going to deck him. Why would you give him money? And he's like, I just need to think about it. And she kind of comes to the conclusion herself. She's like, right, well, he's not going to let this rest. So she takes out some jewelry, and she's like, right, you may pawn this, because he said he has 700 in his account and he needs 300 more because he is convinced that Morgan's father is innocent, and he wants to get the best lawyer in the country, the man who's like never lost a murder case in his life, but he needs 300 quid from somewhere, so he went to him to ask. So he gets the money to go to the lawyer.
Yeah, they go to Ackerman. Norman Ackerman's office is the guy's name. He isn't there, but his like secretary or his kind of second in command is. And they pay the retainer $1,000, and they say, look, he's going to be back in town later this evening. So come by then, and we can sort this all out. Morgan says to Dixon that he's amazing and that she can kiss him. So again, the two of them are growing closer. And she says, look, my job's after firing me because I'm bringing too much heat on them. Like, no one wants to be associated with the daughter of a murder suspect, of a potential murderer. So that's not great. And but at Martha's restaurant, they go back and they seem to be obviously much closer, and they carry on like they're pretty much full on dating at this point, which Martha kind of notices. But then another cop comes in and he says the lieutenant wants him. So Morgan says, I'll go visit Ackerman, you go deal with that. So Morgan, she goes to Ackerman's office. But then when Dixon gets back to the precinct, the chief is furious with him for getting into a fight with Scalise's men. And he says, you're taking a week's vacation. That's the end of it. I'm not hearing anything else about it, because do you realise how this looks? Like, you have to put us in such a bad position here, because any chance we had of kind of getting to the bottom of this now, you've completely prejudiced the investigation, where it's like you literally look like you were on a one-man warpath, and it's not going to look great on a jury if fucking one of the lead detectives is literally prejudicing an investigation like that.
Yeah, and they also have Steve in custody. Yeah. So it's pretty funny. After they send Dixon out, he actually says to the lieutenant, Now, if you have to, go over him the way Dixon would, which is kind of like a wink and a nudge that they don't openly acknowledge Dixon's tactics, but like they say that like when it comes to the likes of Scalise that well, you kind of got to do it in these situations if you want to get what you want. That being said, Dixon does go to Morgan and he's pretty upset because all the man has is his job, so to be forced to take a week's holiday is basically his idea of hell, and he's straight back on the case. But he goes to Morgan, and she tells him that Ackerman wouldn't take the money. He wouldn't take the case, and she says she's convinced that if Ackerman doesn't want the case, it's because he knows that her father's going to get done for murder, and that there's too much evidence there. Yeah, he says
Ackerman told her that he's too busy, but like she's smart. She knows that it's because he thinks that there's no chance of winning it, so he's not going to put an L on his record if he doesn't have to.
Yeah, exactly. And he says, "Oh well, we'll get other lawyers. We'll get other lawyers. It's fine." But yeah, it's actually not fine. Things aren't going quite as well for the team as we kind of hoped.
They do share a kiss at this point, though, so that's nice for them. Dixon tells her he's wrong, and he says he's going to figure out what to do about Mr. Taylor. But yeah, things aren't in a great spot, like I said. So then Dixon jumps into a cab with Willie from earlier, who's he's a parolee who he knows kind of is linked to Scalise. He knows he has connections to Scalise, and he tells Willie, "I'll cover for you for violating your parole," because he knows he's gone back into some shady stuff. "I'll cover for you if you tell me where Scalise is." So then Willie, they go to like a payphone, and Willie calls Kramer, who's Scalise's number 2, and he says Dixon's on to you. So for some reason Dixon has just trusted that Willie's going to do the right thing here, so he doesn't actually hear Willie.
Well, I think he kind of accepts that things aren't going to go his way.
He probably
actually no. As a matter of fact, he does accept because we kind of figure out his motives when they do meet.
That's fair. Yeah.
He gets the parolee to set up the meeting, and he goes to the meeting, and when he gets there, it's actually a pretty cool elevator shot. And then when he's brought into the office, Scalise actually. Sorry, go ahead.
He put some things in motion before that. It's just because he goes back to his hotel, and he calls for a messenger for himself. Yeah, so he basically writes a letter to Morgan explaining that he was Sandy Dixon's kid, and Sandy Dixon was a big mob guy, a big mobster. And he says, "Look, everyone thought I was just like him, a chip off the old block, but like I was determined not to be. I was determined to be the opposite of that, and that all went to shit as soon as I accidentally killed Payne." So he's fessing up to it at this point. He says that he covered it up like a mobster, but he's going to get Scalise for the police before he dies, and then they can arrest him for Dixon's murder. So pretty cleverly, he's kind of serving himself up on a platter here because he knows it's either prison or death. So he's like, right, if they can't get Scalise in any other way, I'll make it look, and I'll basically taunt Scalise into murdering me so that then they can go and arrest Scalise. And then he labels the letter to be opened in case of my death. So then, we get to the warehouse scene that you said.
Yeah, and Scalise actually turns out to be a little more intelligent than we realised, because Scalise's prodding him and calling him a bit of an idiot, and he's like, one false move out of you and these guys are trained to shoot you on sight. If you so much as throw a punch, they'll shoot you. And straight away he throws a punch and one of the lads shoots him, and Scalise's like, "Oh, stop. This guy's trying to get killed.
He clearly wants.
Yeah. And he pieces together, in Scalise's head anyway, that the reasoning behind Dixon doing this is kind of to save his own reputation. He's basically trying to put the murder on Scalise so that if Scalise then was to murder him, it would look like Scalise did all 3 murders, and it would then save Dixon's reputation. So Scalise straight away is like, "No, we're not doing that. You get over there, treat his bullet wound. He's not dying here. We're not going down for that." And they start treating the wound, and then all of a sudden the phone calls, and Steve has ratted them out.
Yeah,
Steve has said that they did the Morrison murder. He completely confesses to that being Scalise and his men, and the cops are on the way because they can hear the sirens outside. So they all do a runner, and they leave Dixon inside, and they go straight back to that big old elevator that we saw earlier. That was pretty cool.
Yeah, Dixon has a brainwave at this point, so he turns off the power, the kind of main power, which means that the elevator doesn't work, and they can't escape. So yeah, it's implied then that the cops kind of surround them, and they do manage to arrest all of the guys. So the next day, Morgan said that they're letting the father leave, that they've decided not to go through with it after all. And the chief says to Mark, fair play to you, I'm going to recommend you to be re-promoted back to your old kind of rank. And he gives Dixon back the letter that Dixon had written and says, I didn't open it because it says that only need to be open in case you're dead, and you're not dead, so why would I? And then Dixon has kind of a moment of reflection where he looks down and he looks at Morgan and he's like, I want you to open the letter. The chief is obviously a bit perplexed, but he opens it anyway. And the inspector reads the letter and he's shocked, obviously. And he says, okay, I'm arresting you for the manslaughter of Kenneth Payne. Morgan's obviously distraught to figure this out. But she reads the letter and Dixon says, look, I never meant for any of this kind of thing to happen.
Yeah.
But she says that she's going to give him another chance, and they kiss goodbye.
Yeah, and that's enough to live for. This is his closing line. And that's the where the sidewalk ends. Yep. It's a good film. It's a good noir. Gave it 3.5 stars. I think it's a very enjoyable film. I think it is somewhat stereotypical at points, but I think the stereotypical stuff it does well. I think, as you said, Dana Andrews' performance is very good. Gene Tierney doesn't get as much screen time as I would have liked. And, it's just not... It doesn't have the quick pans, the just kind of genius level editing that Laura has, and direction. It's still very good, but it's not quite there. I can't help but compare the two, I'm sorry. But I still think it's very good. I would definitely recommend it, especially if you like a noir. It's definitely worth a go. And... yeah, again, 95 minutes. Most of these film noir aren't particularly long anyway, but it's a good one for sure. What do you think?
Yeah, co-sign a lot of what you just said. Really solid, enjoyable noir. Probably a notch or two below Laura, like I said, and definitely a couple of notches below the really, really great noirs. Laura probably is in that category, to be fair, but it's like the really, really great ones, which, who knows what we'll cover later in this little arc.
It's a mystery.
Figure it out for yourselves if you can. I enjoyed Dana Andrews a lot in this. Gene Tierney, like I said, doesn't get as much. I will say I think Scalise, it's a good performance by Gary Merrill. Turns out that he was actually meant to be like a kind of a drug user, but Hayes Court at the time didn't really want to make that as obvious. So there's a scene where he's kind of sniffing. It's like a nose kind of spray kind of thing. It's implied that that's meant to be drugs. Yeah,
what can you do?
It is what it is. I think it would have been more interesting if they had kind of been allowed to explore those kind of things, because he does come across a bit like a conventional kind of 2-bit villain. He doesn't really paint too much. Like, Dixon's so hell-bent on getting the Scalise guy, and obviously it's implied that he's done a lot of bad stuff, including killing Morrison, but we don't really ever see that, to be honest. Like, even the Morrison death happens off screen because initially you had to think that it's Payne who did that murder. From that point of view, but I do think Dana Andrews does a really good job. He's more responsibility in this than he does in Laura in terms of driving the narrative forward and really taking responsibility for making the conflict and the tension and the just the remorse that he has for killing Payne. But obviously he is doing bad stuff to cover it up for most of the runtime. So it's as well. I don't think the romance with Morgan works quite as well as it does in Laura, I'd say. I think
no, definitely not.
The yearning that McPherson has for Laura is even before he actually, even before a certain event happens in that film, the yearning that he has doesn't really connect in the same level in this when it comes to Dixon and Morgan, I think, in my opinion. But it's a solid thriller, solid noir, I should say, and probably not like absolutely essential noir, but still really enjoyable and worth a watch.
Yeah. Shane, In the meantime, before we wrap things up, because we're good for time, have you watched anything recently?
Yeah, so I've managed to get a few films actually, a bit more watched this week than I kind of have in the past. So last night I finally got to see Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. Everyone knows, if you're a regular listener to the podcast, you'll know how much the two of us love Claude Rains. I mean, he's so great in that film. Like Jimmy Stewart in probably the most um, conventional Stewart performance. Like it's almost like Stewart as like the American everyman who is like a literal Boy Scout who comes to represent like truth, justice, the American way, kind of the really idealistic version of what he thinks American could be. So it's almost like that role was written for Stewart, and it's almost like the roles he would later go on to do would be in some ways all influenced by Mr. Smith, by Jefferson Smith. But Claude Rains as the other senator from that state, I think the film doesn't work nearly as well if you don't have him in that role. The guy is just incredible. I don't want to sound like a broken record, but yeah, he's one of the great actors of the era. Like I just can't get enough of the guy. He's so good. So I really enjoyed it. I love Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. Also saw Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula. Say that 5 times in a row.
Massively on my watch list. That's so high up on my watch list at the minute.
Say that 5 times in a row if you can. Yeah, Francis Ford Coppola's version of Dracula, titled Bram Stoker's Dracula. One of the horniest movies I've seen in my life. This thing is like every frame of this thing is like. It wouldn't shock me if Coppola had like just a year's supply of the blue stuff, the blue tablets when he's making this. Like the guy literally, it's so horny. This film, like the most horny version of Dracula you could ever think of. Gary Oldman, like it's a few different versions of Dracula all in one, because not to spoil things too much, but the film kind of tracks Dracula across quite a large time period as well, I'd say. So from that point of view, Gary Oldman gets to play Dracula in various kind of iterations on the same film. But it's a lot of fun, very over the top, gloriously over the top, very, very camp. It's just an extravaganza of excess, I think is what I call that in my Letterboxd review, and I stick by that because it's just like everything is just amped up to the nth degree. It's really enjoyable stuff. And I finally also saw John Carpenter's The Thing, which
what a movie!
For some reason, I'd never. Yeah, it's incredible. Like it really is an amazing. Keith David is the fucking man as well. Keith David is one of the.
He's so great.
Look, Kurt Russell is amazing. I love Kurt Russell, but Keith David, his voice alone, let alone everything else, his voice alone is so cool, so commanding. It's a cracking movie. The Thing really lived up to my expectations. So they're the main ones. Again, checked a few films off there that I've been wanting to watch for a long time. So it's been a successful week from that point of view, really. What about yourself?
Yeah, so since the last episode, I've actually watched a few films. I have seen House of a Thousand Corpses, Rob Zombie. What a film! In every sense of the word, like there's so much in there. It's so strange. It's so bizarre. You can tell that it's got all the hallmarks of like your classic like cinema masterpiece. It's got like the split diopter shot and the like the zoom that Hitchcock always did, where the guy with the person's there. What's it called? The zoom where like the background just kind of swells around a person. There's so many of them little moments that Rob Zombie does, and he's got so many homages to other horror films. Like it's so Texas Chainsaw coded, like especially the ending, and yeah, for that alone, it's so creative. Now, it's Rob Zombie, so like it's filled with like trash and it's seedy and gross, but you can't help but just admire his actual. There's such a clear love for direction here. I also watched his Halloween reboot, which is definitely not as good as House of a Thousand Corpses, but I think it definitely does enough to try and warrant itself. It's interesting that the entire first half of the film is about basically what happened after the murder, but not when he's grown up. It's basically his entire time with Loomis is basically the first half of the film. That was pretty interesting. And then the second half is just like a straight up horror movie. But again, there's just these little moments of really brilliant direction. There's one, I've never been a fan of shaky cam or jump scares, but there's an instance with shaky cam and there is one jump scare in that film that are both some of the best uses of both of those techniques I've probably ever seen. They're both very, very, very well done. There's a few that I covered in that tier list video. I watched Rosemary's Baby. Incredible.
I want to watch that, yeah.
Yeah, you want to talk about a jump scare, is to see it's so subtle. And it calling it a jump scare almost feels like a disservice to it, because it's not like a loud noise or anything. It's just you see a thing happen in the background of a hallway. There's no sound effect or anything. It's just the fact that you see it happen. It's like, oh, no. It's so frightening. And yeah, the ending is very 60s coded. And then I watched The Omen immediately after. What a great thing to do, is to do a double feature of Rosemary's Baby and The Omen. You talk about a woman who may or may not be giving birth to the Antichrist, and then a movie where a child may or may not be the Antichrist. Like, watching the two of them back to back is, certainly an interesting double feature. I would recommend doing it as well. You kind of get the best out of the two movies. As well, I saw The Haunting, which is phenomenal. I haven't seen The Haunting of Hill House, but The Haunting is class.
I want to watch The Haunting of Hill House.
Yeah, it's so good. Would definitely recommend it. One of the best examples of a movie making its location a character probably ever in horror. Yeah. It's so good. And yeah, that's kind of all I've watched recently. And besides, of course, Laura and Where the Sidewalk Ends. And you're going to go and check my letterbox to see what noirs I've watched recently, so you can have a look at what next week's episode is. No, I bet you I haven't watched it yet. I bet you I still haven't watched it, so you won't find out. You won't find out just yet, because I always leave it last minute.
I might deliberately not review mine either until like the day before.
I was tempted. I was tempted to deliberately just not review them.
Yeah.
But we'll see where we go. As well though, like in the month of November, we'll both be watching plenty of noirs anyway. Yeah, sure. Especially if we're doing like any top 10s or tier lists or anything. That's not anything we've agreed on, but just hypothetically. So I'd say we'll probably watch a lot of noirs between us, which should hopefully kind of create a smoke screen around the ones that we are actually covering.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's true.
But I think that'll do it for this week. This has been the Golden Hour Film Podcast, and next week is noir-vember. I'm not telling you. Try and figure it out for yourself. And yeah, on Wednesday you'll know what next week's episode is. Is next week episode 30?
It
is.
Question. Yeah, I think it is. Yeah, it is.
Damn.
Yeah,
episode 30. Look at us go.
Yeah,
Happy days.
You're right. Actually, it is.
Yeah. Well, I'll see you all for episode 30 next week, in which we'll be covering a film noir.
Yeah.
I have been Harry Bailey.
I have been Shane Mulvaney.
And we'll see you then. Thank you very much.